what happens when the government raids the wrong home, and then argues they can't be held accountable. The Supreme Court just dropped a 9-0 bombshell that could change everything. Imagine being asleep in your home when suddenly FBI agents break down your front door, throw flashbang grenades inside, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint. The nightmare becomes even worse when you discover this all happened because they raided the wrong house. When you try to hold the government accountable for their catastrophic mistake, they argue they can't be sued because their agents have discretion in planning these raids and are allowed to get things wrong. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. This exact situation went all the way to the Supreme Court, which issued a unanimous 9-0 decision in favor of the family who endured this terror. Yet incredibly, now that the case has returned to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals following that Supreme Court decision and remand, the government is still arguing that the Supreme Court ruling should have no impact on the outcome whatsoever. The case we're examining is called Martin versus the United States, and it originates from a suburban Atlanta area where the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid in 2017. The fundamental problem was simple yet devastating. They had the wrong address. The family inside the raided home decided to sue the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, commonly known as the FTCA. The central legal question the courts had to address was whether the federal government could simply walk away from liability or whether someone could actually sue them and attempt to hold them accountable for these types of catastrophic mistakes. The case was recently remanded back to the 11th Circuit for a new ruling in light of what the Supreme Court articulated in that unanimous decision. Following that Supreme Court ruling, the case returned to the 11th Circuit for a fresh decision. The government has now responded based on what the Supreme Court said, and in their brief, federal attorneys argue that the Supreme Court ruling should not affect this case's outcome at all. The facts of what happened are deeply troubling. The FBI executed a raid led by FBI Special Agent Lawrence Guerrera, who was tasked with leading a pre-dawn operation against a home where suspected gang members were believed to be hiding. The agents had scouted the street where the individuals were believed to be located. However, the agent put the address into his personal GPS, and that GPS directed him to the wrong house, which was 3 doors down from the actual target they were planning to raid. The GPS routed him to a completely different home, where Katrina Martin lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son at the time. The agents claimed the house did not have numbers displayed showing the address, and they did not double-check the mailbox before deciding to breach the home, because they also claimed time was critical and they didn't have time to verify the address. When the FBI agents arrived at that house, they knocked on the door, then quickly smashed in the front door and threw in flashbang grenades. Eventually, they found Katrina Martin and her boyfriend hiding in a closet. Her boyfriend had a shotgun with him when they were in the closet. The boyfriend was pulled out and handcuffed, and Katrina Martin was also pulled out and held at gunpoint while she was half-dressed since this happened early in the morning. After the agents had detained the family, they conducted a search of the home. While performing that search, one of the agents noticed mail that had a different address than the one they were supposed to be at. That's when they had their realization moment and understood they had raided the wrong home. They then decided to leave quickly, went 3 doors down, raided the correct home, and told the family they would return later to explain what happened. In response to this entire ordeal, the family decided to sue the federal agency based on the mistakes that occurred during that raid. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is a law that allows people to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts by federal employees when those employees are acting within the scope of their job. Normally, the government and individual agents are shielded from such lawsuits. But the FTCA is one of those situations where the federal government has agreed to allow people to bring these types of tort claims against them. However, the FTCA comes with a long list of exceptions where the government cannot be sued. One of those exceptions was at issue in this case, and is called the discretionary function exception. That exception shields the federal government when the wrongful act stems from an official making a discretionary decision. In this case, the FBI claimed that discretionary decision involved how the agents planned the raid, how they scouted for the raid, and how they executed it. When the family filed their lawsuit in federal district court, the government moved to dismiss the case and argued that both the intentional tort and discretionary function exceptions barred this type of claim. The case was then appealed to the 11th Circuit, and once again, the 11th Circuit ruled in favor of the FBI. The case then went to the United States Supreme Court. A petition for certiorari was sought and granted by the Supreme Court, which issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that unanimous ruling, written by Justice Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and sent the case back down for re-review and a new decision. That Supreme Court remand sent the case back to the 11th Circuit for new briefs and a new decision on whether the discretionary function exception bars the Martins' negligent and intentional tort claims from what they brought against the FBI based on that wrong house raid. The federal government has now issued their new brief. They have filed their supplemental brief to the 11th Circuit in light of what the Supreme Court said. In the brief, the government argues that the 11th Circuit should still rule the same way despite what the Supreme Court just said because the family's claims are still barred under other laws and still under the FTCA. The government's central position is that the agent's mistaken entry into the wrong home resulted directly from a discretionary decision. They contend that this discretion involves how to conduct the pre-raid surveillance, how to approach the house in the dark, how to navigate without alerting suspects, and how to identify the structure from its external features based on identifying characteristics they find in accordance with their plan. They state that no statute, regulation, constitutional rule, or binding policy dictated the specific steps that the agents had to take, and based on that, they had discretion to plan for that raid. In the brief, the government argues that while it is true they were given a specific address as the place of execution, the officer had to make numerous decisions regarding how to execute the warrant. This, they claim, is the epitome of discretion. Based on that argument, they contend that the actions still fall within the FTCA's discretionary function exception and that the federal government cannot be held responsible for those mistakes. The reason this matters so significantly is because wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrests, and excessive force situations happen frequently and impact many law-abiding gun owners. When raids go bad, they can lead to deadly consequences. There have been numerous high-profile situations where gun owners are raided by federal agencies and things go terribly wrong. If the government can hide behind this broad discretion they claim every time they make a mistake, then there is effectively no accountability. The Supreme Court's ruling in Martin potentially narrows the government's ability to avoid these types of lawsuits by claiming broad discretion and broad immunity. This case reinforces that the federal government may be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home, potentially misuse their power, or simply make catastrophic mistakes. However, in this new brief, the federal government continues to argue that the actions here fall within their discretionary authority and that the case should be dismissed based on the agents also having qualified immunity. That's what's currently happening in this critical case. As a result of the new 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court in this challenge, the federal government is still claiming they have broad immunity based on discretion and the agent's discretion to potentially plan raids and still make mistakes. Right now, we must wait and see how the plaintiff responds to this in the 11th Circuit. As this develops further and more information becomes available, updates will follow on this significant case that could reshape government accountability for law enforcement mistakes.